When beautiful socialite Victoria Pierce gets engaged to wealthy James Anderson, no one suspects she's actually his secret half-sister, orchestrating an elaborate revenge plan against their father, who abandoned her and her sick mother 25 years ago. But as her perfect scheme unfolds, she discovers that revenge might cost her the one thing she never knew she wanted: a real family. But before we continue this emotional story, make sure to hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from today. The morning sun shone through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria Pierce's penthouse apartment. At 25, she had everything most people could dream of: beauty, fame, and now an engagement ring worth more money than her mother had made in her entire life. Victoria touched the giant diamond on her finger and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone who was finally seeing their plan come together. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Marcus asked, adjusting his camera equipment. To the world, he was just her photographer, capturing her perfect life for her millions of social media followers. But Marcus was much more: her real partner, her confidant, and the only person who knew the truth. Victoria walked to her vanity mirror and touched up her lipstick. "I've been planning this for 7 years, Marcus, ever since I found those old letters in Mom's attic and learned the truth about William Anderson." The truth. The word felt bitter in her mouth. William Anderson, one of the richest men in the city, wasn't just her fiancé's father. He was her father too. The same man who had thrown her mother Sarah out of his mansion 25 years ago when she got pregnant, forcing them to live in poverty while he built his empire. "James will be here any minute," Victoria said, checking her phone. Her fiancé, James Anderson, was the perfect son of a perfect family, and he was completely, hopelessly in love with her. Sweet, naive James. "He actually thinks I want to wait until marriage because I'm old-fashioned." Marcus snorted. If he only knew his perfect fiancée was his half-sister. "Don't." Victoria's voice turned sharp. "We never say that out loud. One wrong word and everything falls apart." She walked to the window, looking out at the city below. 7 years of carefully crafted plans had led to this moment. She'd built her modeling career from nothing, made herself famous on social media, created the perfect image of a charitable, kind-hearted socialite. Also, she could get close to James Anderson. The doorbell rang. Victoria quickly wiped away the coldness from her face and replaced it with the warm, loving smile she'd perfected over the years. "Coming, honey," she called out sweetly. Before opening the door, she turned to Marcus. "Remember, William Anderson is visiting that new restaurant. It's on 5th Avenue today. Make sure everything is ready." Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. They'd been tracking William's movements for months, waiting for the perfect moment to set their trap. Today, William would get his first taste of who Victoria really was, or at least who she wanted him to think she was. "Victoria!" James's voice called from the other side of the door. "Are you there?" She took one last look in the mirror, checking her mask of perfection. The caring fiancée, the future Anderson bride. If only they knew what was coming. Victoria opened the door to find James standing there with a bouquet of roses. He was handsome, kind, and completely innocent in all of this. For a moment, she felt a twinge of guilt, but she pushed it away. This wasn't about James. This was about William Anderson, and making him pay for what he'd done to her mother. "Those roses are beautiful," she said, reaching up to kiss James on the cheek. "You spoil me too much." James wrapped his arms around her. "Nothing's too good for my future wife." Victoria hugged him back, hiding her face so he couldn't see her expression. In her mind, she could see her mother Sarah, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table, while William Anderson lived in his mansion and pretended they didn't exist. "I have a surprise for you," James said, pulling back with excitement in his eyes. "Dad wants to have dinner with us tonight. He says he has something important to tell us." Victoria's smile never wavered, even as her heart began to race. "Tonight? But I thought he was busy with work. He cancelled his meetings, says family comes first." James beamed with pride. "He's really warming up to you, Victoria. I told you he would." If only James knew that at this very moment, his precious father was walking into a trap that would begin the destruction of everything he held dear. Victoria felt the weight of her phone in her pocket, knowing that in a few hours, she would have the first piece of evidence to use against William Anderson. "That's wonderful news," Victoria said, her voice sweet as honey. "But first, I need to stop by that new restaurant on 5th Avenue. They say it's amazing, and I wanted to check it out for our wedding reception." James kissed her forehead. Always thinking ahead. That's my girl. Victoria smiled, letting him believe what he wanted to believe. Soon, William Anderson would learn that the karma he'd been avoiding for 25 years was finally catching up to him, and it was wearing a designer dress and $1 million engagement ring. "Let me just grab my purse," Victoria said, walking back to where Marcus stood silently watching. She gave him a subtle nod. Everything was falling into place. The game was about to begin, and Victoria Pierce was playing to win, no matter who got hurt in the process. The Bella Rosa restaurant sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware. William Anderson adjusted the worn coveralls of his janitor disguise, feeling strange without his usual designer suit. He'd spent the morning watching his future daughter-in-law through the restaurant's windows, waiting for the right moment. "I don't like this, sir," Robert, his most trusted security guard, whispered through the earpiece. "There are other ways." To check her background, William grabbed his mop and bucket. "A woman who wants to marry my son needs to have a good heart, Robert. Money can fake a lot of things, but it can't fake kindness." If only William knew that Victoria had been watching. Him too. From her regular table by the window, she sipped her mineral water and checked her phone. Marcus had texted her. The old man took the bait. He's dressed as a janitor. Victoria smiled to herself. Everything was going exactly as planned. She'd made sure William's private investigators would discover her regular lunch visits to Bella Rosa. She'd known his suspicious nature would drive him to investigate her himself. "More water, miss?" A waiter approached her table. "Not now," Victoria snapped, letting her mask slip just enough. She'd carefully cultivated her reputation here over the past month. Rude to the staff, demanding, completely different from her public image. Right on cue, William Anderson, disguised in his janitor's uniform, accidentally bumped into her table while mopping. "Watch what you're doing," Victoria's voice carried across the restaurant. She stood up, towering over William in his stooped position. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" William kept his head down, playing his part. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it was an accident." Victoria pulled out her phone and started recording. This is exactly what's wrong with the service industry today. No pride in their work, no respect. The other diners started watching. Some looked uncomfortable. Others pulled out their phones too. "Please, ma'am," William said, his heart sinking. "At Victoria's behavior. I could lose my job." Victoria's laugh was cold and cruel. "Maybe you should lose your job. Maybe then you'd learn to watch where you're going." She turned to the restaurant manager who had hurried over. "I want him fired." "Now?" William straightened up slightly, having seen enough. His future daughter-in-law wasn't the angel she pretended to be. But before he could leave, Victoria said something that made his blood run cold. "People like him remind me of my mother," she said loudly. "Always scrubbing other people's floors, cleaning up other people's messes. But at least she knew her place." William's hands tightened on the mop handle. Something about the way she said it. Victoria turned back to him, her eyes meeting his for just a second. In that moment, William saw something that chilled him to the bone. Recognition. She knew exactly who he was. "You can go now," she said dismissively, waving her hand. "I'm sure there are plenty of other tables you can ruin." William backed away, his mind racing. As he hurried to the employee area to change, his phone buzzed. It was a video message from an unknown number. He opened it to find the recording Victoria had just made, but this version continued after he'd left. Victoria was speaking directly to the camera. "Didn't recognize me, did you, William? But then again, you didn't recognize my mother Sarah either, after you threw her out 25 years ago." William's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on a storage room chair. Sarah, the housekeeper he'd had an affair with, the woman he'd paid to disappear when she told him she was pregnant. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "Dinner tonight. Should be interesting, don't you think? I wonder what James would say if he knew his perfect father isn't so perfect after all." In her car outside the restaurant, Victoria watched William through the window. She could see him sitting there, his world starting to crumble. Marcus lowered his camera, having captured everything. "Phase 1 complete," he said with a grin. Victoria didn't smile back. "Phase 1 was the easy part. Now we destroy everything he loves piece by piece." Her phone rang. It was James. For a moment, she stared at his smiling photo on the screen. Sweet, innocent James, who had no idea. His fiancée was about to tear his family apart. "Hello, darling," she answered, her voice honey-sweet again. "Yes, I'm so excited about dinner tonight. I have a feeling it's going to be a night to remember." In the restaurant storage room, William Anderson finally stood up on shaky legs. He had to stop this. He had to protect James. But as he reached for his phone to call his lawyers, another message arrived. Don't even think about it. One word to James or anyone else, and tomorrow morning every news outlet in the country will know how William Anderson abandoned his pregnant housekeeper and illegitimate child. TikTok daddy, see you at dinner. Victoria's plan was working perfectly. But what she didn't know was that revenge, like a double-edged sword, often wounds the person wielding it just as deeply as its intended target. The Anderson mansion stood like a castle against the evening sky. Victoria pulled up in her white Mercedes, checking her makeup one last time in the rearview mirror. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. All set. Every room is bugged. We won't miss a word. The front door opened before she could ring. The bell. James stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, his face lighting up at the sight of her. There's my beautiful fiancée. Victoria let him pull her into a hug, breathing in his expensive cologne. For a split second, she felt that familiar twinge of guilt. James didn't deserve what was coming. But then she remembered her mother's tiny apartment, the night Sarah had gone hungry so Victoria could eat. Victoria! William's voice came from behind James. He stood in the foyer, looking impeccable in his dinner suit. Nothing like the janitor from this afternoon. Their eyes met, and the air crackled with tension. Mr. Anderson, Victoria smiled sweetly. Thank you for having me for dinner. The Andersons' longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, appeared to take Victoria's coat. Victoria watched William's face. As the old woman helped her, did he see Sarah's ghost in every housekeeper? Did he wonder how many other secrets were serving dinner in wealthy homes? Dinner is served in the main dining room, Mrs. Chen announced. The dining room was a monument to old money. A crystal chandelier hung over a table that could seat 20, though tonight it was set for just 3. Victoria took her seat beside James, directly across from William. The chef has prepared your favorite, son, William said, his voice steady despite his pale face. Beef Wellington. You're too good to us, Dad. James smiled, squeezing Victoria's hand under the table. Victoria raised her wine glass. Yes, William, you've always been so generous. To some people, at least. William's hand tightened on his fork. James, oblivious to the undercurrent, launched into a story about his day at the office. And then the client said, James was saying, but Victoria had stopped listening. She was watching William, watching him try to maintain his composure, while his world teetered on the edge of destruction. Actually, Victoria interrupted, pulling out her phone, I wanted to share something interesting that happened today. I took a video at this lovely restaurant on 5th Avenue. William's wine. Glass froze halfway to his lips. Victoria, he said sharply. Perhaps this isn't the time. Oh, but I think it's exactly the time. Victoria's voice turned cold. James, darling, don't you want to see how your father spent his afternoon? Dad? James looked between them, confusion clouding his face. What's going on? Victoria's finger hovered over the play button. Should I tell him, William, or should I show him? That's enough. William stood up so suddenly, his chair crashed backward. James, son, I can explain everything. Explain what? James stood too. Dad, you're scaring me. Victoria, what's going on? Victoria rose slowly, power radiating from her every movement. Yes, William. Explain. Explain how you like to spy on people. Explain how you dress up as a janitor to test their character. Or better yet, her voice dropped to a whisper, explain to your son who Sarah Pierce was. The color drained from William's face. Please, he whispered, not like this. James looked lost. Who's Sarah Pierce? Sarah Pierce was a housekeeper here, 25 years ago. Victoria's eyes never left William's face. She was my mother, your mother. James shook his head. But what does that have to do with... She was pregnant, Victoria cut him off. Pregnant with your father's child. And when she told him, he threw her out into the street, gave her $10,000 to disappear and never come back. James staggered backward. Dad? Tell me this isn't true. William sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. James, son, I never knew. I didn't think what? Victoria's voice rose. Didn't think she'd survive? Didn't think that baby would grow up? Well, surprise, William. That baby grew up. That baby put herself through school, built a career, and now she's standing in your dining room wearing your son's engagement ring. The words hung in the air like smoke. James looked like he'd been hit by a truck. My fiancée, he whispered. So you're my sister? Victoria laughed, but there were tears in her eyes. Half-sister, technically. Surprise, big brother. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the shouting but quickly backed away. All this time, James turned to Victoria, his voice breaking. Our whole relationship, it was just about getting revenge on my father. To your father, Victoria spat the words. He was my father first. Where was he when my mother was working 3 jobs to send me to school? Where was he when she got sick and couldn't afford treatment? She pulled the engagement ring off her finger and threw it on the table. I never loved you, James. How could I? Every time I looked at you, I saw everything I should have had, everything he gave to you and denied me. James stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Without another word, he ran from the room. James, William called after him, but his son was gone. Victoria stood over William, trembling with emotion. How does it feel to watch your perfect family fall apart? But William wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her at the doorway. Victoria turned. There, leaning against the doorframe, pale and thin in a hospital gown, was Sarah Pierce. Mom, Victoria whispered. What are you? You're supposed to be in the hospital. Sarah took a shaky step into the room. I couldn't let you do this, Victoria. I couldn't let my bitterness destroy you too. And just like that, Victoria's perfect plan began to unravel. Someone help Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Chen rushed forward as Sarah's knees buckled. William jumped up instinctively, reaching her before she could fall. Victoria stood frozen, watching her mother in William's arms, the same arms that had pushed them away 25 years ago. How did you even know I was here? Marcus, Sarah said weakly, letting William and Mrs. Chen help her. To a chair. He called me at the hospital, told me everything. Victoria's face went white. Marcus betrayed me. He cares about you. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. He saw what this revenge was doing to you, how it was poisoning your heart. William knelt beside Sarah's chair, his face lined with guilt and shock. Sarah, I had no idea. All these years. Don't. Sarah cut him off. This isn't about us anymore. She turned to Victoria. Baby, I know you think you're doing this for me, but revenge won't pay for my cancer treatments. It won't give us back those years. Victoria's carefully constructed walls began to crack. They deserve to suffer like we suffered. No one deserves to suffer. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Not them, not us, not you. Heavy footsteps came from the hallway. James returned, his eyes red from crying. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the scene before him. James? Victoria started, but he held up his hand. I heard everything, he said. I was in the security room watching the cameras. Marcus called me too. Victoria sank into a chair, her perfect plan dissolving around her. Marcus called everyone, didn't he? Because he loves you. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. Like I love you. And love means stopping someone from making a terrible mistake. William cleared his throat. Sarah, about your treatments, it let me... No! Victoria jumped up. We don't need your money now. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? James asked quietly. Because it seems like it's about a lot. More than just revenge. Victoria looked at her mother, so fragile in the fancy dining room chair. At William, grey-faced with guilt. At James, the brother she'd never allowed herself to have. The tears she'd held back for years finally broke. Free. I just wanted him to see us, she whispered. To know we existed, that we mattered. Oh, baby. Sarah opened her arms, and Victoria fell into them, sobbing like a little girl. We always mattered, with or without his approval. Mrs. Chen quietly brought water for everyone. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandelier and expensive paintings, had become a confessional. I need to tell you something, Sarah said, stroking Victoria's hair. Something I should have told you years ago. She looked at William. Something I should have told both of you. Victoria lifted her head. Mom, I didn't just leave because... William told me to. Sarah's voice trembled. I left because I was scared. Scared of the scandal, scared of ruining his marriage. My marriage was already over, William interrupted. Barbara and I were separated. We just hadn't made it public. I didn't know that, Sarah said. And I was too afraid to ask, so I took the money and ran. Not because he forced me, but because I chose to. Victoria stood up slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes we create stories to protect ourselves. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand again. I let you believe your father was a monster because it was easier than admitting I was a coward. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Victoria looked around at these people, her family, whether she wanted them or not. I think, James said carefully, we all created stories about each other Dad made you into a gold digger. You made him into a villain. I made you into my perfect fiancé. He gave a sad laugh. None of us saw the real person underneath. Victoria's phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus. Did they all make it there? Are you okay? She stared at the screen, remembering all the nights she and Marcus had planned this revenge. How he'd tried to warn her that it was consuming her. How he'd finally chosen to save her from herself. The treatments, William said suddenly. Sarah, please, let me help. Not out of guilt, but because... He looked at Victoria. Because she's my daughter, and you're her mother. Victoria felt something shift inside her. The hatred that had fueled her for so long began to crack, letting in a tiny beam of light. James, she said softly, I'm sorry. You deserved better than being a pawn in my game. James nodded, his eyes full of hurt, but also understanding. We all deserved better. Maybe now we can try to be better. Sarah tried to stand, but swayed. Slightly. Immediately, both William and Victoria reached to steady her. Their hands touched on Sarah's shoulder. Father and daughter, connected by the woman they both loved, both had hurt, and both wanted to help. Marcus is waiting outside, Sarah said. He'll take me back to the hospital. She looked at her daughter. Will you come with me? We have a lot to talk about. Victoria hesitated, looking at William and James. The perfect revenge had been within her grasp. But maybe, just maybe, forgiveness would taste sweeter than revenge. The fluorescent lights of St. Luke's Hospital cast harsh shadows on Sarah's face as the doctors rushed her into the emergency room. She had collapsed in the car on the way back from the Anderson mansion, her body weak from leaving the hospital against medical advice. Mom! Victoria ran alongside the gurney, her designer heels clicking on the linoleum floor. Please, Mom, stay with me. Marcus caught up with her, pulling her back as the medical team wheeled Sarah through the double doors. Let them work, Victoria. There's nothing we can do right now. Victoria spun around, her face streaked with mascara. This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so focused on revenge, I would have seen how sick she was getting. Behind them, footsteps echoed in the corridor. William and James had followed them to the hospital. Victoria's first instinct was to lash out at them, but Sarah's words from earlier stopped her. No one deserves to suffer. How is she? William asked, his voice rough with concern. They won't tell me anything, Victoria said, running her hands through her hair. I'm not immediate family because I'm not listed on her insurance. They need someone to sign papers for emergency surgery, but I can't. Yes, you can. William stepped forward, pulling out his phone. Gerald, I need you at St. Luke's Hospital immediately. Bring whatever paperwork is necessary to add Sarah Pierce and Victoria to my family insurance policy. Backdate it if you have to. I don't care what it costs. Victoria stared at him. What are you doing? What I should have done 25 years ago, William said, putting his phone away. Taking responsibility. James touched Victoria's arm gently. Let us help, Victoria. Please. A doctor emerged from the emergency room, looking tired. Ms. Pierce's condition is critical. The cancer has spread more than we thought and her heart is very weak. She needs immediate surgery but without insurance. The insurance is being taken care of. William stepped forward. I'm her... He glanced at Victoria. I'm family. Whatever she needs, cost is not an issue. The doctor nodded. There's something else. We need a blood donor. Miss Pierce has a rare blood type and our blood bank is running low. Test me, Victoria said immediately. I'm her daughter. Me, too, James added. When everyone looked at him in surprise, he shrugged. We're siblings, right? Maybe I'm a match. Victoria felt tears welling up again. After everything she'd done to hurt him, James was still willing to help save her mother. Marcus squeezed her hand. I'll get tested too. We'll find a match, Victoria. William's lawyer arrived with the paperwork, and within minutes, Sarah was officially covered under the Anderson family insurance. The doctors rushed her into surgery, while the others went to get tested as potential blood donors. In the waiting room, Victoria sat with her head in her hands. All her careful plans for revenge seemed meaningless now. What good was destroying the Andersons if she lost her mother in the process? She's going to make it, Marcus said, sitting beside her. Sarah's a fighter. She raised you alone, didn't she? Victoria looked up at him. Why did you call them? Why did you ruin everything? Marcus took her hand. Because I love you, Victoria, and I watched this revenge plan eating away at your soul for 7 years. When Sarah told me how worried she was about you, I knew I had to do something. I had them right where I wanted them, Victoria whispered. The evidence, the recordings, everything was perfect. But at what cost? Marcus asked softly. Look at James. He just found out his fiancée is his sister, that his father had a secret child, and instead of falling apart, he's in there getting tested to save your mother's life." Victoria looked across the waiting room where James sat, with his head bowed, praying. William paced nearby, making calls to every specialist he knew. "I wanted them to hurt like we hurt," Victoria said. "But maybe what? Maybe we've all hurt enough." The doctor returned, looking grave. "We found a match for the blood donation." Victoria stood up. "Who?" "Mr. Anderson," the doctor said. "William is compatible." Victoria felt the room spin. The man she'd hated for so long was now going to help save her mother's life. William stepped forward without hesitation. "Where? Do you need me?" As they led William away, he stopped beside Victoria. "When I saw Sarah tonight standing in my dining room after all these years, I realized something. I've been a coward. I let fear of scandal and what people would think stop me from doing the right thing. I can't change the past, but I can try to make things right now." Victoria watched him follow the doctor, her emotions a storm of confusion and conflict. Her phone buzzed, a message from the reporter she'd planned to send the evidence to tomorrow. "Ready for the Anderson expose? Just say the word." Victoria's finger hovered over the phone. With one word, she could still destroy William Anderson's reputation forever. But as she looked around at the people waiting with her, Marcus, James, even Mrs. Chen, who had insisted on coming to the hospital, she realized something. Revenge might destroy William Anderson, but it would also destroy any chance of the one thing she'd wanted most as a little girl, a real family. Just then, the emergency light above the operating room flashed red, and alarms started blaring. "Code blue in OR3, a voice announced over the speakers. "Code blue in OR3. Victoria's heart stopped. OR3, that was where they had taken Sarah. "Mum!" Victoria screamed, running toward the operating room. Marcus caught her before she could burst through the doors. "You can't go in there," he held her as she struggled. "Let the doctors do their job." James joined them, his face pale. "Dad's in there too, getting the blood drawn. He'll make sure she's okay." Victoria collapsed against Marcus, her legs giving out. The waiting room chairs filled with the strange family fate had thrown together, the vengeful daughter, the betrayed son, the loyal friend, and the faithful housekeeper. All waiting, all praying in their own ways. Minutes stretched like hours. Victoria's phone kept buzzing with messages from the reporter, each one feeling like a knife in her heart. "Sources say you have dirt on William Anderson. Story goes, to print tomorrow morning. This could destroy him." Finally, she turned the phone off and threw it in her purse. Right now, nothing mattered except the woman fighting for her life behind those operating room doors. "Victoria," James said softly, "tell me about her." "About your mum?" Victoria looked at him, surprised. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. She's part of my family too, isn't she?" Through tears, Victoria started talking. She told him about Sarah's amazing meatloaf, how she'd work double shifts but still make time to help Victoria with homework, how she'd taught Victoria to hold her head high, even when they couldn't afford new clothes for school. "She never said a bad word about your father," Victoria admitted. "Not once. I found out the truth from old letters in the attic. That's when the hate started growing. But it was my hate, not hers." Mrs. Chen brought them all coffee from the hospital cafeteria. "Your mother," she said to Victoria, "she used to sing while she worked. Beautiful songs in Spanish. The whole house felt lighter when she was there." Victoria stared at her. "You knew her?" "I started working for the Andersons right after she left." Mrs. Chen nodded. "Mr. Anderson would get this look in his eyes whenever someone mentioned her name. Now I understand why." The operating room doors opened. Everyone jumped to their feet as Dr. Phillips emerged, looking exhausted. Behind him came William, a bandage on his arm where they'd drawn blood. "She's stabilized," Dr. Phillips said. "The next 24 hours will be critical, but the blood transfusion helped. Mr. Anderson, your blood may have saved her life." Victoria looked at William, really looked at him for the first time. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face lined with worry. He looked less like the mighty William Anderson and more like a man carrying 25 years of regret. "Can I see her?" Victoria asked. Dr. Phillips nodded. "She's being moved to ICU, one visitor at a time." Victoria turned to William. "You should go first." Everyone stared at her in shock. "Victoria," William's voice broke, "are you sure?" "She'd want to know you're okay after giving blood," Victoria said. "And I think you two have things to talk about." As William followed the doctor, Victoria pulled out her phone. 10 missed calls from the reporter. Tomorrow's headline could still destroy everything William Anderson had built. "I saw the way he looked at her," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "When they brought her into the operating room, that's not the look of a man who abandoned someone he loved. That's the look of a man who's been punishing himself for 25 years. James touched Victoria's arm. "Whatever you decide about the story, just know that I understand why you did everything you did, and I forgive you." Victoria's hands trembled as she unlocked her phone. Marcus watched her, understanding in his eyes. 7 years of planning, he said. 7 years of hate. Maybe it's time to let it go. Victoria opened her messages to the reporter. Everything she'd gathered, the proof of William's affair, the payments to Sarah, the fake documents he'd used to hide everything, it could all go public with one word from her. She thought about her mother, who had never wanted revenge. About James, who offered forgiveness when she least deserved it. About William, literally giving his blood to save Sarah's life. Her fingers moved across the phone. "Story's dead. No comment." The reporter replied immediately. "What? This could make your career." "The evidence," Victoria typed back. "Some things are more important than revenge." She deleted all the evidence from her phone, then turned to James. "I need to tell you something. About Victoria Pierce." "What about her?" "She doesn't exist. I created her, the perfect socialite, the influencer, the charity supporter. My real name is Isabella Martinez. My mother raised me with her maiden name." James smiled sadly. "Nice to meet you, Isabella." William returned from the ICU, his eyes red. "She's asking for you, Isabella." The name sounded strange coming from him, but right somehow. "Victoria." Isabella stood up, ready to see her mother. But first, she had one more thing to say. "William," she said softly, "thank you for saving her." "No," he shook his head. "Thank you for giving me a chance to try to make things right." As Isabella walked toward the ICU, she felt lighter than she had in years. Victoria Pierce and her perfect revenge were gone. Now it was time for Isabella Martinez to find out who she really was, without the mask of hatred she'd worn for so long. Behind her, she heard James ask William, "Dad, tell me about the day you met Sarah." And for the first time since this long night began, Isabella smiled. Some secrets, it seemed, were better shared than kept. The morning sun crept through the hospital window, casting a gentle glow on Sarah's sleeping face. Isabella sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand, while machines beeped steadily in the background. Their week had passed since the surgery, and each day brought small improvements. "You should get some rest," Marcus said from the doorway. "You've been here all night." Isabella shook her head. "I'm not leaving her." "Then at least eat something." William walked in carrying a paper bag from the expensive cafe down the street. "The doctor said your mother's test results are looking better today." It still felt strange, this new version of William Anderson. Gone was the powerful businessman who struck fear into corporate boardrooms. In his place was a man who brought coffee every morning, who knew all the nurses by name, who sat for hours just watching Sarah breathe. "Isabella?" Sarah's voice was weak but clear. She'd been waking up more often lately. "Are you fighting with your father again?" "No, Mama." Isabella squeezed her hand. "We're all here together." Sarah smiled. "Good. Life's too short for fighting." Her eyes drifted to William. "You look tired, Billy." Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Billy?" William actually blushed. That's what she used to call me back then." "Tell her about the garden parties," Sarah said, her voice dreamy with medication. "Remember, you taught me to dance." James appeared in the doorway just in time to hear this. He'd been coming by every day, bringing books and magazines for everyone. "Dad, you never told me you could dance." "There's a lot of things you don't know about your father," Sarah said, "like how he used to sing in the shower. Horrible voice." "Mom!" Isabella tried to stop her, but she was secretly fascinated. This was a side of William Anderson she'd never imagined existed. "It's true," William admitted. "I was a terrible singer, still am. But Sarah..." He looked at her with soft eyes. Sarah had the voice of an angel. Marcus watched from the corner, camera in hand. But these days, he wasn't gathering evidence for revenge. He was capturing moments for a family piecing itself back together. "Ms. Martinez." A nurse appeared with paperwork. Isabella still wasn't used to hearing her real name in public. "The insurance." "Papers came through, everything's covered, including the experimental treatment Dr. Phillips recommended." William stepped forward. "I told you any treatment she needs." "I know," Isabella cut him off, "but I want to help too. I've been talking to my modeling agency." I'm going back to work under my real name this time. James smiled. Isabella Martinez. It suits you better than Victoria Pierce. Everything suits her, Marcus said quietly. She just needed to find herself again. Sarah tried to sit up and everyone rushed to help her. My children, she said, looking at Isabella and James. Both of you, together. Isabella felt tears threatening again. James put his arm around her shoulders, and this time she didn't pull away. I've been thinking, William said. The Anderson Foundation's annual gala is next month. We raise money for various causes, and this year, he took a deep breath. This year, I'd like to start a new initiative, supporting single parents and their children, in Sarah's name. The room went quiet. Isabella looked at her mother, who had tears in her eyes. Billy, Sarah whispered, you don't have to. Yes, I do. William's voice was firm, not out of guilt, but because it's right. Because every parent deserves support. Every child deserves a chance. James stepped forward. I'll help. I can head the initiative. We'll need a face for the campaign, Marcus added. Someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can bridge the gap between privilege and struggle. He looked meaningfully at Isabella. Isabella felt the weight of their expectations, but for once it didn't feel like a burden. I'll do it, but not as a society princess, as myself, as someone who knows what it's like to need help. Mrs. Chen appeared with more coffee and her famous homemade soup. Sarah, you must eat to keep up your strength. And you too, Isabella. A family can't heal on empty stomachs. Family. The word didn't hurt anymore. I have something to show you all, Marcus said, pulling out his tablet. I've been working on a video. Not the revenge kind, he added quickly. Something else. He pressed play. On the screen appeared images of the past week. William dozing in the hospital chair, holding Sarah's hand. James reading aloud while Isabella slept curled up on the window seat. Mrs. Chen teaching the nurses her soup recipe. Sarah smiling weakly at her children, both of them, as they argued over who got to fix her pillows. Set to the video was a song, a Spanish lullaby that made Sarah gasp. That's the song you used to sing, Mrs. Chen smiled. I remembered. As the music played softly, Isabella looked around the hospital room. A week ago, these people had been enemies or strangers. Now, we're going to need a bigger house, James said suddenly. What? Isabella looked at him. Well, Mom needs somewhere to recover after she gets out of the hospital, and you can't keep living in that penthouse. It's not you anymore. And Marcus practically lives with us already. James, William warned, but he was smiling. I'm just saying, James continued. The mansion has plenty of room, and Mrs. Chen makes enough food for an army anyway. Sarah reached for both her children's hands. My darling, slow down. Life doesn't have to be decided all at once. But Isabella saw the hope in her mother's eyes, the same hope she felt growing in her own heart. Actually, she said slowly, I've been thinking about going back to college, to finish my degree in social work, the one I abandoned when Victoria took over. William's eyes lit up. The foundation could use a social worker. One step at a time, Marcus reminded them, but he was grinning too. Outside the window, the city was waking up. Somewhere out there, Victoria Pierce's face still graced magazine covers and billboards, but in this room, Isabella Martinez was finally truly coming home. The Anderson mansion looked different in the morning light as Marcus helped Sarah up the front steps. After 3 weeks in the hospital, she was finally strong enough to come home to a place she'd once worked as a housekeeper. Are you sure about this? Isabella asked her mother for the 100th time. We could get our own place. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. Honey, at my age, pride is a luxury I can't afford. Besides, she smiled at William, who was carrying her bags. Some of my happiest memories were made in this house. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself. The mansion's grand entrance hall was filled with flowers, and a banner reading, Welcome Home Sarah, hung from the balcony. The smell of her famous chicken soup filled the air. Your room is ready, Sarah, Mrs. Chen said, beaming. I put fresh flowers by the window, just like you used to do. As they helped Sarah settle into her new room, the best guest suite in the mansion with a view of the gardens, Isabella couldn't help but notice it was right next to William's master bedroom. Her parents might think they were being subtle, but she saw the looks they shared when they thought no one was watching. The press is outside again, James announced, coming in from checking the mail. They're still trying to figure out what happened to Victoria Pierce. Isabella walked to the window. Sure enough, photographers lined the street. hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious socialite who had vanished overnight. "Maybe it's time we gave them their story," Marcus suggested. "On our terms." William nodded slowly. "The foundation gala is next week. We could use it to announce the new initiative for single parents, and," he looked at Isabella, "introduce Isabella Martinez to society." "I don't know," Isabella hesitated. "The last time I was at one of those parties, I was plotting revenge." "Then this time plot something good," Sarah said from her bed. "Show them who you really are." James pulled out his phone. "Speaking of the gala, you'll never guess who called. Remember that children's charity Victoria? I mean you used to work with. They want to partner with the foundation." Isabella felt a wave of guilt. "I only worked with them to build my fake image." "But the work you did was real," James reminded her. "Those kids don't care if you were Victoria Pierce or Isabella Martinez. They just know you helped them." A commotion downstairs interrupted them. Mrs. Chen's voice floated up. "You can't just barge in here." Isabella rushed to the hallway, followed by Marcus and James. At the bottom of the grand staircase stood Regina Winters, editor of Society Pages magazine, and her photographer. "Victoria Pierce," Regina called out. "Or should I say Isabella Martinez? The public deserves to know the truth." Before anyone could stop her, Isabella started down the stairs. But this time, she wasn't wearing Victoria's designer clothes or perfect makeup. She was just Isabella, in jeans and a simple sweater, her dark hair falling naturally around her shoulders. "The truth?" Isabella's voice carried across the marble floor. "The truth is that Victoria Pierce was a mask. A character I created because I was angry and hurt, but she's gone now." Regina's photographer started snapping pictures. "And who are you now? The long-lost Anderson heir?" "I'm Sarah Martinez's daughter," Isabella said proudly. "And yes, William. Anderson is my father. But this isn't a scandal, Ms. Winters. It's a story about healing." William appeared beside her on the stairs. "Which you can hear all about at next week's foundation gala. Now please leave. My family needs privacy." Family. The word still sent a shiver through Isabella. After security escorted Regina out, Isabella found herself in the mansion's vast kitchen. Mrs. Chen was teaching Marcus her soup recipe, while James attempted to make coffee with the complicated new machine. "You did good out there," William said, joining her. Standing up to Regina. "I learned from the best," Isabella smiled. "Victoria Pierce never backed down from a fight." "No, but Isabella Martinez faces them with grace." Upstairs they heard Sarah's laugh floating down. She was probably sharing more embarrassing stories about William with anyone who would listen. "I keep waiting," Isabella admitted quietly. "For what? For it all to fall apart? For the hate to come back? For someone to reveal it's all been another trick?" William was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep waiting for? To wake up and find out I don't have a daughter after all. That I lost my chance at knowing you forever." From his corner of the kitchen, Marcus quietly filmed their conversation. These days, his camera captured healing instead of ammunition. "The gala's going to be hard," Isabella said. "Everyone will be watching, judging." "Let them," James said, finally figuring out the coffee machine. "We'll get through it together." Mrs. Chen appeared with a tray of cookies. "First, everyone eat. A family meeting needs cookies." As they gathered around the kitchen island, the millionaire businessman, his long-lost daughter, his son, the ex-revenge conspirator photographer, and the housekeeper who had kept everyone's secrets. Isabella realized something. Victoria Pierce had spent years orchestrating the perfect revenge, but Isabella Martinez had found something better, the perfect second chance. The Anderson Foundation's annual gala transformed the city's finest hotel ballroom into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over elegant tables, while photographers lined the red carpet outside. But in a small preparation room, Isabella Martinez stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, from her wheelchair. She was still weak, but nothing could have kept her from this night. Isabella smoothed down her simple black dress, so different from the flashy outfits Victoria Pierce would have worn. "I'm scared, Mum." "I know, mi amor." Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. "But you're not alone anymore." A knock at the door announced James's arrival. "Everyone's asking about you. Are you ready?" Isabella took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." The ballroom fell silent as William Anderson took the stage. He looked distinguished as always, in his tuxedo, but there was something different about him tonight. A softness in his eyes when he looked at Sarah's wheelchair in the front row. "Welcome, everyone," he began. "Tonight isn't just about raising money. It's about truth, redemption, and second chances." Whispers rippled through the crowd as he continued. 25 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I let fear and pride keep me from acknowledging my own daughter." The whispers grew louder. In the corner, Regina Winters from Society Pages was practically salivating over her notebook. "Many of you knew her as Victoria Pierce," William said, "but tonight I'm honored to introduce you to my daughter's true self. Ladies and gentlemen, Isabella Martinez." Isabella stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. The crowd's reaction was immediate: gasps, murmurs, the rapid clicking of cameras. But she kept her eyes on her mother's proud smile. "Hello," she said into the microphone. "I know you all have questions about Victoria Pierce, about who I really am. The truth is, I spent years planning to destroy my father's reputation out of revenge for abandoning my mother and me." The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Marcus, filming from the side, gave her an encouraging nod. "But revenge only breeds more pain," Isabella continued. "Tonight we're announcing the Sarah Martinez Initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting single parents and their children, because no one should have to face their struggles alone." Applause broke out, led by James in the front row. But then a voice cut through the celebration. "This is ridiculous." A woman in an expensive red dress stood up. Barbara Anderson, William's ex-wife and James's mother. "William, you can't seriously be acknowledging this. This imposter." "Barbara," William's voice held a warning. "Don't. That girl is nothing but a gold digger." Barbara pointed at Isabella. "She deceived James, infiltrated our family. Like you deceived everyone?" Sarah's quiet voice somehow carried across the room. She wheeled herself forward. "Should we talk about why you really divorced William, Barbara? About the young tennis instructor and the private villa in Spain?" Barbara's face went white. "How dare you? I was your housekeeper too, remember?" Sarah's eyes were steel. "I kept your secrets then, but I won't let you hurt my daughter now." James stood up. "Mom, please. Isabella is my sister. Either accept that or leave." The room held its breath. Barbara looked around at the sea of faces, realized she was losing, and stormed out. "Well," Marcus whispered to Isabella, "it wouldn't be an Anderson event without some drama." The gala continued. Donors lined up to support the new initiative. Society photographers clamored for pictures of the Anderson family. All of them, including Sarah and Isabella. Even Regina Winters seemed touched by the story of redemption. Later, during the dance portion of the evening, Isabella watched her parents from across the room. William had insisted on helping Sarah stand, supporting her. Weak legs as they swayed gently to the music. "Just like the garden parties," Sarah was saying, her head resting on William's shoulder. "I was horrible at dancing then too," William replied, making her laugh. James joined Isabella at her table. "They're not fooling anyone, you know. Think we should tell them we know they've been having dinner together in Mom's room every night. Let them have their secret for now." James smiled. "They deserve some happiness." Marcus captured it all on film. The dances, the tears, the reconciliations. But his favorite shot was of Isabella, finally looking peaceful as she watched her family come together. The night was winding down when an unexpected guest arrived. Dr. Phillips from the hospital hurried in, waving a folder. "Sarah," he called out. "Isabella, the latest test results. The treatment is working. The cancer is responding." The ballroom erupted in cheers. Isabella hugged her mother, both of them crying. William kept saying, "Thank God," over and over, while James called for champagne. In all the celebration, no one noticed Barbara Anderson standing at the back of the room, watching. No one except Mrs. Chen, who saw the tears in the woman's eyes before she turned and walked away. As the gala ended, Isabella found herself on the hotel's balcony, looking out over the city lights. Marcus joined her, camera finally set aside. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked. "I was just thinking, Victoria Pierce would have hated this night, all this honesty and forgiveness." Isabella smiled. "But I loved every minute of it." Inside, they could hear Sarah laughing at something William said. James was talking excitedly about plans for the initiative. Mrs. Chen was wrapping up leftover desserts to take home. "Ready?" "To go home?" Marcus asked. "Home. To the mansion that had once represented everything she hated but now held everything she loved." "Yes," Isabella said. "But first," she reached for Marcus's hand, pulled him close, and kissed him. After all, every good soap opera needed a romance. 6 months had passed since the gala. The Anderson Mansion's garden was in full bloom. decorated with white chairs and flower arches. But this time it wasn't for a wedding. It was for a celebration of life. "The doctor says I'm in complete remission," Sarah announced to the gathered crowd of family and friends. She stood on her own now, her strength returning more each day. "But that's not the only thing we're celebrating today." Isabella stepped forward holding Marcus's hand. "The Sarah Martinez Initiative has already helped 50 single-parent families with housing and education, and today we're opening our first community center." William beamed with pride. The past months had changed him too. His hair was a little grayer, his smile a little softer, especially when he looked at Sarah. "Speaking of announcements," James interrupted, grinning, "I think Dad and Sarah have something to tell us." William and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. "How did you—" William started. "Dad, we found the ring box in your jacket last week," James laughed, "and Mom's been humming wedding songs for days." Isabella hugged her mother. "Really? You're getting married? If that's okay with you both." Sarah looked between her daughter and James. "Are you kidding?" Isabella wiped away happy tears. "It's about time." Mrs. Chen appeared with champagne for everyone. "I already started planning the menu." As their friends and family celebrated around them, Isabella felt Marcus squeeze her hand. "Should we tell them our news too?" She touched the small bump hidden by her flowing dress. "Let's wait. This is their moment." Barbara Anderson's arrival caused a brief pause in the celebration, but this time she came bearing a gift, a check for the initiative. "I was wrong," she said simply, "about everything. James, Isabella, I'd like to be part of your lives if you'll let me." The siblings shared a look, then nodded. There had been enough hatred in their family. Later, as the party moved into the mansion's grand living room, Isabella found herself back in the garden. This was where Victoria Pierce had first plotted her revenge, sitting in these same chairs, filled with anger and pain. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Marcus asked, joining her with his ever-present camera. "Just thinking about Victoria," Isabella said. "She seems like a dream now, like someone else's life. Do you miss her?" "No." Isabella smiled, touching her stomach. She never knew what it was like to be truly happy. Inside, they could hear Sarah singing, that same Spanish lullaby from their hospital days. William's horrible voice tried to join in, making everyone laugh. "I've been editing the footage," Marcus said. "From the hospital, the gala, everything. I thought maybe we could show it at the wedding. The story of how hate turned to love, the story of the Martinez-Anderson family, all the secrets, all the pain, but also all the healing." Isabella leaned against him. "Speaking of family stories, how do you feel about the name Sarah for a girl, or William for a boy?" Marcus kissed her forehead. "I think they're perfect." They walked back inside to find James teaching Mrs. Chen to use social media. The initiative needs a strong online presence, while Barbara and Sarah looked through old photo albums. William was on the phone, probably arranging some surprise for the wedding. "You know what's funny?" Isabella said to Marcus. "Victoria Pierce spent years trying to destroy this family, but Isabella Martinez, she helped build it instead." Sarah called everyone together for a photo. As they gathered, William and Sarah. In the center, James and Barbara on one side, Isabella and Marcus on the other. Mrs. Chen insisted on being included. Isabella felt a profound sense of peace. The secrets that had torn them apart had finally brought them together. The cost had been high, years of pain, months of plotting, weeks of uncertainty. But as the camera flashed, capturing the happy faces of this unlikely family, Isabella knew it had all been worth it. "I love you all," Sarah said, looking around at her expanded family. "Even when I was angry, even when I was hurt, I never stopped loving." William kissed her cheek, and that love saved us all. Isabella touched the small life growing inside her, a new generation, one that would be born into love instead of secrets. Victoria Pierce's story had ended, but Isabella Martinez's was just beginning, and this time she couldn't wait to see what happened next. The end.